Welcome back to Ben's Book Club. Today we are diving into the book, Teach Yourself to Think. So, let me ask you guys something right off the bat. Do you just assume thinking is, something that happens automatically, kind of like breathing or your heart beating? Well, in this explainer, we're unpacking the absolutely groundbreaking work of psychologist Edward de Bono, and he completely shatters that assumption. He brings up this incredible premise that thinking isn't just some innate talent you're born with or a passive function. It's actually a deliberate, highly mechanical, and most importantly, a completely learnable skill. Think about it like carpentry or maybe cooking. You aren't just born knowing how to build a gorgeous cabinet, right? And according to de Bono, you aren't just born knowing how to think effectively either. It requires actual tools, deliberate practice, and a specific framework.
Okay, let's dive into this, because this is arguably de Bono's most provocative claim. Intelligence is absolutely not the same thing as thinking. So think of intelligence as basically the horsepower of a car, right? It's your raw cognitive potential. Thinking, on the other hand, well, that's the skill of the driver. You could literally have a massively powerful, high-horsepower sports car, but if the driver has absolutely zero skill behind the wheel, that car is definitely ending up wrapped around a tree or crashed in a ditch. And the exact same rule applies to our brains. High intelligence absolutely does not guarantee good thinking if you don't actually know how to steer your own thoughts.
And that leads us directly to this fascinating concept that de Bono calls the intelligence trap. See, because our society so heavily praised just being smart, highly intelligent people actually fall into this trap all the time. Instead of using their massive mental capacity to deeply explore a subject and find the actual truth, they end up using their immense intelligence just to defend a predetermined point of view. They have so much verbal and mental horsepower that they can easily construct these incredibly complex arguments to make almost any bad idea sound completely right.
So, let's be totally honest for a second here. I want to playfully call out all of our egos right now, mine included. Have you ever defended a genuinely terrible idea simply because you are articulate enough to do it? Come on, I think we've all been there. You realize halfway through an argument that, oh wow, I'm probably wrong here, but your brain is so good at connecting dots and arguing that you just keep going anyway and you win the debate. This perfectly highlights the fatal flaw in assuming that being quote-unquote smart automatically makes you a good thinker. A lot of times, it literally just makes you a much better rationalizer of really poor ideas.
Now, a huge reason we fall into that trap is pretty much due to our Western obsession with the Socratic method. Traditional education basically teaches us this adversarial style of thinking, right? Taking a hard position, aggressively looking for contradictions, and vigorously defending our point just to win. Well, de Bono argues this is wildly inefficient. Instead, he proposes what he calls parallel thinking. Instead of standing face-to-face fighting over who is right, parallel thinking asks everyone to literally stand shoulder to shoulder, looking in the exact same direction, so you can collaboratively map out all the possibilities together without all the fighting.
And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how we achieve that parallel thinking. Enter the TLO-POSOGO framework. I know, it kind of sounds a bit like a magic chant, but this is actually a phenomenal 5-step mechanical recipe designed to completely replace those chaotic, messy internal monologues that we usually mistake for thinking. By using these 5 simple words as signposts, we can actually guide our minds, and our teams for that matter, through a deliberate process that stops us from just wandering aimlessly. Let's break down each stage so you can actually start using it today.
So we start with TO. Where are we going? This is the definition stage. Every single thinking session should start with a really clear purpose. But honestly, let me ask you, why do we find it so incredibly hard to just sit still for 5 minutes and clearly define the problem before we jump straight to a conclusion? De Bono points out that the single biggest failure in thinking is simply not knowing what you are actually trying to do. We constantly confuse frantic mental activity with real progress, when what we really need to do is just stop for a second and set the objective.
All right, so once we actually know where we're going, we move to LO. What is the landscape? This right here is the information gathering stage. We're surveying the field, figuring out what we know, what we definitely don't know, and how different stakeholders actually perceive the whole situation. Now, the absolutely crucial rule here, and you really need to keep this in mind, is you have to do this entirely without judgment. No way around it. You must deliberately avoid filtering this information just to fit your own biases. You're simply mapping the territory here. You aren't deciding which path to take quite yet.
But honestly, here is where most of us completely fail. Have you ever caught yourself jumping straight to SO? Have you ever totally skipped the objective setting, blew right past mapping the landscape, and jumped straight into making a hard decision before you even truly understood the situation? Yeah, me too. De Bono argues this is exactly why so many of our decisions turn out poor. We skip the essential early stages just because our brains naturally want to rush to the finish line to save energy. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is we've reached the most fascinating step, PO. PO stands for provocative operation. It's actually a completely made-up word that de Bono invented specifically to signal the deliberate breaking of mental patterns. This is where his famous concept of lateral thinking lives. This is the highly generative, creative stage where you just throw out wild, completely crazy ideas to escape your standard assumptions. And the golden rule of PO? Absolutely no criticism is allowed, period. You are not evaluating ideas here. You are literally just forcing your brain to generate new possibilities.
To show you just how incredibly powerful this is, consider this specific example from the source material. Pro, what if we charged customers for not using our product? Now, initially, that sounds completely absurd, right? Like, no way. But actually, that's exactly the point. A provocative operation is a linguistic tool meant to be put forward purely for its provocation, not as a finished logical solution. It deliberately disrupts your brain's standard efficiency patterns. Maybe throwing out that crazy idea leads you to a massive, game-changing breakthrough about subscription models or engagement incentives. Basically, you have to deliberately get a little lost to find totally new paths.
So, after we've generated all those wild, out-of-the-box possibilities, we finally arrive at SO. Which one do we actually pick? This is the selection and refinement stage. This is where we narrow down that massive chaotic PO list to the most viable options. And how exactly do we evaluate them? Well, by checking them directly against the original objective we set all the way back in step 1, the TO. We rein in those wild ideas and carefully refine them into a logical, practical solution that actually solves the core problem we originally defined.
Now, you might be looking at all this rigid structure and thinking to yourself, okay, but what about human feelings? Are we all just supposed to be robots? Well, de Bono has a brilliant take on this. Emotion chooses the path, logic builds the map. He absolutely does not dismiss emotions at all. He just strongly believes they belong right here in the selection stage. Emotions shouldn't be secretly hijacking the early logic and information gathering stages. First, you use logic to build a super accurate map of all your options, and then you use your emotions and your intuition to choose which path on that map you actually want to walk down.
Which brings us to the final step in the whole shebang. Go. How do we act? De Bono is just relentlessly practical here, and he really drives home the point that all of this structured thinking, all the intricate mapping and lateral ideas, well, they're completely useless if they don't result in a concrete next step. Thinking is fundamentally incomplete unless it ends in a firm decision and a tangible action. The go stage forces you out of your own head, gets you off the whiteboard, and throws you right into reality.
So as we zoom out and look at this entire framework, it naturally brings up a pretty vital philosophical question. Is structure the enemy of creativity? A lot of people feel that using a mechanical recipe for thinking restricts their freedom. It feels too rigid. But de Bono argues the exact opposite. He argues that total, completely unstructured freedom is actually paralyzing. It leads straight to confusion and that chaotic internal monologue we talked about earlier. By giving your brain a deliberate, sturdy framework, you actually free up your mental energy to be truly, wildly creative within those boundaries.
So, I want to challenge you today. Take a completely mundane problem. Maybe it's a workplace frustration, terrible traffic, or even just a creative block, and run it through this Tolo Pogo So method. Just give it a try and see how it completely changes the way you process the entire situation. Practice the actual skill of thinking. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and subscribe so you don't miss an episode.